The massive alien warship Dominion's Edge hung in the darkness of space like a metallic predator. Its hull stretched for miles, bristling with weapons that could turn entire planets to ash. Inside its command center, a group of Zorathi warriors gathered around a holographic display, their scaled faces twisted with amusement. "Look at this," hissed Commander Vextar, his 4 yellow eyes gleaming as he manipulated the hologram. The humans call themselves warriors. The display showed grainy footage from Earth, soldiers in camouflage, tanks rolling across desert terrain, fighter jets screaming through cloudy skies. The assembled Zorathi warriors clicked their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their species. "Pathetic," growled Lieutenant Krashul, her massive frame towering over the others. "They fight with crude explosives and metal projectiles. Their so-called advanced weapons wouldn't even scratch our armor." Captain Thexano, the youngest of the group, studied the footage with curious intensity. Unlike his companions, he wasn't laughing. Something about the humans intrigued him, the way they moved, the determination in their eyes, even in the face of impossible odds. "Commander," Thexano said carefully, "what about their stories, their legends?" Vexitar's attention snapped to him. "Stories? You mean their myths?" "Yes, sir. Intelligence reports mention tales of humans fighting gods, slaying monsters, defeating impossible enemies through," Thexano paused, "through will alone." The command center erupted in harsh, chittering laughter. Krashul's massive fist slammed onto the console, making the entire structure vibrate. "Will?" she wheezed between laughs. "Did you hear that?" "The young captain thinks human fairy tales are worth studying. These creatures," Vextar said, switching the display to show human mythological artwork, "tell stories about mortals challenging gods, about warriors who never surrender, even when facing certain death, about ordinary beings performing extraordinary feats through something they call the human spirit." More laughter filled the air, but Thexano noticed something else. In the shadows at the edge of the command center, a figure stood motionless. Fleet Commander Zyroth had been silent throughout the entire discussion, his ancient form barely visible in the dim light. "They believe," Vextar continued, his voice dripping with mockery, "that courage and determination can overcome any obstacle, that the will to fight can somehow make up for inferior technology and weaker biology." "Ridiculous," spat another warrior. "We've conquered 17 species across this galaxy. Not one of them had will strong enough to stop our fleets." Thexano's eyes drifted to the human footage again. He watched a small squad of soldiers moving through rubble-strewn streets, outnumbered and outgunned, yet still advancing toward their objective. There was something in their movements, a refusal to give up that he'd never seen in other species. "Sir," he said quietly, What if nothing?" Vextar cut him off. "In 72 hours we begin the invasion of Earth. They're pitiful. Defenses will crumble in minutes. Their warrior spirit will break like glass against our superior might." The hologram switched to show Earth itself, a blue and green marble hanging in space, seemingly defenseless against the massive alien armada approaching its borders. Hundreds of Zorathi warships moved in perfect formation, each one capable of devastating an entire continent. "The humans have no idea we're coming," Krashul said with satisfaction. "Their primitive sensors can't detect our stealth fields. By the time they realize what's happening, their major cities will already be in flames." But as the warriors continued their planning, none of them noticed that Fleet Commander Zeroth had quietly slipped away from the shadows. The ancient warrior moved through the ship's corridors with purpose, his weathered face bearing an expression that would have surprised his subordinates. It wasn't the look of a conqueror preparing for an easy victory. It was the look of someone who had seen something the others had missed, something that made him very, very afraid. Fleet Commander Zyroth's private quarters were unlike any other space on the Dominion's Edge. While the rest of the ship gleamed with cold metal and harsh lighting, his chambers held relics from dozens of conquered worlds. Weapons, artwork, and trophies from fallen civilizations lined the walls like silent witnesses to countless victories. But tonight, Xyroth wasn't looking at his collection of conquests. He stood before a secured data terminal, his clawed fingers moving across holographic controls with practiced ease. The screen flickered to life, displaying files marked with the highest security classifications. Personal log, stardate 4847.3. He spoke into the recorder, his voice barely above a whisper. I am compiling this record in the event that my worst fears prove correct. The screen showed footage that no other Zorathi had seen, classified intelligence gathered by deep reconnaissance probes that had been studying Earth for decades. Not just military assessments, but detailed observations of human behavior in crisis situations. The others mock human mythology, Xyroth continued, but they fail to understand what these stories truly represent. They are not fantasies. They are blueprints. His fingers traced across the display, bringing up incident after incident. A human firefighter running into a burning building to save strangers. A mother lifting a crashed vehicle to free her trapped child. Soldiers holding defensive positions against overwhelming odds, not because they had hope of victory, but because retreating was simply unthinkable. In every species we have encountered, Xyroth said, his voice growing heavier, there exists a breaking point, a moment when survival instinct overrides all other considerations, when the rational mind accepts defeat as inevitable. He paused the recording and enlarged one particular file. It showed grainy footage from what humans called World War II. Soldiers advancing across a beach under withering enemy fire, many falling, but others continuing forward despite witnessing the deaths of their comrades. Humans appear to possess something we have never encountered before. When their backs are against the wall, when defeat seems certain, when any rational being would surrender, he stared at the screen. They fight harder. The data files scrolled past, hundreds of examples throughout human history. Sparta's 300 holding back an empire. A single ship called HMS Warspite engaging an entire enemy fleet. Human astronauts manually piloting a damaged spacecraft home against impossible odds. I have witnessed the conquest of 17 worlds, Xyroth said quietly. I have seen species with technology superior to Earth's. I have watched civilizations with billion-year histories kneel before our might. But never have I seen anything like this. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. The screen switched to show Commander Vextar's scaled face. Fleet Commander, the invasion fleet is in position. All ships report ready status. We await your orders to begin the final approach. Xyroth studied his subordinate's confident expression. Vextar had never lost a battle. Never faced an enemy that couldn't be broken through superior firepower and tactical precision. Like most young warriors, he believed that victory was simply a matter of applying sufficient force. Commander, Xyroth said carefully, have you reviewed the psychological profiles of human resistance movements? Vextar's mandibles clicked in amusement. Sir, their resistance consists of small groups hiding in caves and abandoned buildings, hardly a concern for our forces. And their response to overwhelming odds? Panic and surrender, like every other species. Fleet Commander, with respect, the humans are primitives. Their strongest weapons are toys compared to our arsenal. Their fastest ships would take centuries to reach our nearest outpost. They have no technology, no advantage, no fear of death. Xyroth said quietly. The statement hung in the air, between them. Vextar's expression shifted slightly, confusion replacing confidence. Sir? Nothing, Commander. Maintain position and await my signal. The transmission ended, leaving Xyroth alone with his data and his growing dread. He returned to the files, pulling up one final piece of intelligence. Intercepted human communications from military installations around the globe. The messages were simple, direct, and somehow more terrifying than any threat he'd ever encountered. Contact. Lost with monitoring stations Alpha through Delta. Unknown vessels detected at system perimeter. All units to maximum alert. This is not a drill. If you're receiving this message, they're here. Remember your training. Remember your duty. Make them pay for every inch. Xyroth closed the files and walked to the massive viewport that dominated one wall of his quarters. Through the transparent aluminum, Earth hung before him like a jewel, beautiful, peaceful, and utterly unaware of the nightmare approaching from the darkness. But as he watched, tiny lights began to flicker across the planet's surface. Cities going to emergency power, military bases activating defensive systems, orbital installations bringing their weapons online. The humans had found them, and instead of panic, instead of the chaos that preceded surrender on every other world, Xyroth saw something that made his ancient blood run cold. He saw preparation. They knew they couldn't win. Their own intelligence services would have told them that resistance was hopeless. But as he watched, every human military installation on the planet began broadcasting the same message on all frequencies. This is Earth. Defense command to all units. The enemy has arrived. All forces are to engage without reservation. Fight until ammunition is exhausted, then fight with anything you can find. If your position is overrun, fall back and fight again. There is no surrender. There is no retreat. This is our home, and we will defend it. Xyroth's hands trembled as he reached for his communicator. Perhaps there was still time to abort the mission, to report back to High Command that Earth's defenses were stronger than anticipated, but even as the thought formed, he knew it was already too late. The invasion fleet was moving, and somewhere in the depths of space, ancient human myths were about to become terrifying reality. Fleet Commander Xyroth's private quarters were unlike any other space on the Dominion's edge. While the rest of the ship gleamed with cold metal and harsh lighting, his chambers held relics from dozens of conquered worlds. Weapons, artwork, and trophies from fallen civilizations lined the walls like silent witnesses to countless victories. But tonight, Xyroth wasn't looking at his collection of conquests. He stood before a secured data terminal, his clawed fingers moving across holographic controls with practiced ease. The screen flickered to life, displaying files marked with the highest security classifications. Personal log, stardate 4847.3. He spoke into the recorder, his voice barely above a whisper. I am compiling this record in the event that my worst fears prove correct. The screen showed footage that no other Zorathi had seen, classified intelligence gathered by deep reconnaissance probes that had been studying Earth for decades. Not just military assessments, but detailed observations of human behavior in crisis situations. The others mock human mythology, Xyroth continued, but they fail to understand what these stories truly represent. They are not fantasies. They are blueprints. His fingers traced across the display, bringing up incident after incident. A human firefighter running into a burning building to save strangers. A mother lifting a crashed vehicle to free her trapped child. Soldiers holding defensive positions against overwhelming odds, not because they had hope of victory, but because retreating was simply unthinkable. In every species we have encountered, Xyroth said, his voice growing heavier, there exists a breaking point, a moment when survival instinct overrides all other considerations, when the rational mind accepts defeat as inevitable. He paused the recording and enlarged one particular file. It showed grainy footage from what humans called World War II. Soldiers advancing across a beach under withering enemy fire, many falling, but others continuing forward despite witnessing the deaths of their comrades. Humans appear to possess something we have never encountered before. When their backs are against the wall, when defeat seems certain, when any rational being would surrender, he stared at the screen. They fight harder. The data files scrolled past, hundreds of examples throughout human history. Sparta's 300 holding back an empire. A single ship called HMS Warspite engaging an entire enemy fleet. Human astronauts manually piloting a damaged spacecraft home against impossible odds. I have witnessed the conquest of 17 worlds, Xyroth said quietly. I have seen species with technology superior to Earth's. I have watched civilizations with billion-year histories kneel before our might. But never have I seen anything like this. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. The screen switched to show Commander Vextar's scaled face. Fleet Commander, the invasion fleet is in position. All ships report ready status. We await your orders to begin the final approach. Xyroth studied his subordinate's confident expression. Vextar had never lost a battle, never faced an enemy that couldn't be broken through superior firepower and tactical precision. Like most young warriors, he believed that victory was simply a matter of applying sufficient force. Commander, Xyroth said carefully, have you reviewed the psychological profiles of human resistance movements? Vextar's mandibles clicked in amusement. Sir, their resistance consists of small groups hiding in caves and abandoned buildings, hardly a concern for our forces. And their response to overwhelming odds? Panic and surrender, like every other species. Fleet Commander, with respect, the humans are primitives. Their strongest weapons are toys compared to our arsenal. Their fastest ships would take centuries to reach our nearest outpost. They have no technology, no advantage, no fear of death. Xyroth said quietly. The statement hung in the air, between them. Vextar's expression shifted slightly, confusion replacing confidence. Sir? Nothing, Commander. Maintain position and await my signal. The transmission ended, leaving Xyroth alone with his data and his growing dread. He returned to the files, pulling up one final piece of intelligence. Intercepted human communications from military installations around the globe. The messages were simple, direct, and somehow more terrifying than any threat he'd ever encountered. Contact. Lost with monitoring stations Alpha through Delta. Unknown vessels detected at system perimeter. All units to maximum alert. This is not a drill. If you're receiving this message, they're here. Remember your training. Remember your duty. Make them pay for every inch. Xyroth closed the files and walked to the massive viewport that dominated one wall of his quarters. Through the transparent aluminum, Earth hung before him like a jewel, beautiful, peaceful, and utterly unaware of the nightmare approaching from the darkness. But as he watched, tiny lights began to flicker across the planet's surface. Cities going to emergency power, military bases activating defensive systems, orbital installations bringing their weapons online. The humans had found them, and instead of panic, instead of the chaos that preceded surrender on every other world, Xyroth saw something that made his ancient blood run cold. He saw preparation. They knew they couldn't win. Their own intelligence services would have told them that resistance was hopeless. But as he watched, every human military installation on the planet began broadcasting the same message on all frequencies. This is Earth. Defense command to all units. The enemy has arrived. All forces are to engage without reservation. Fight until ammunition is exhausted, then fight with anything you can find. If your position is overrun, fall back and fight again. There is no surrender. There is no retreat. This is our home, and we will defend it. Xyroth's hands trembled as he reached for his communicator. Perhaps there was still time to abort the mission, to report back to High Command that Earth's defenses were stronger than anticipated, but even as the thought formed, he knew it was already too late. The invasion fleet was moving, and somewhere in the depths of space, ancient human myths were about to become terrifying reality. The first wave of the Xyrothi invasion hit Earth's orbital defenses like a cosmic thunderstorm. Massive alien warships, each the size of a city, descended through the planet's atmosphere while their weapons lit up the night sky. The human response was immediate and desperate. Commander Sarah Chen watched the tactical display from the bridge of the orbital defense platform Pegasus Station. The numbers didn't lie. They were outnumbered 50-1, outgunned by technology centuries more advanced than their own. Any rational analysis said they should surrender immediately. All stations, this is Pegasus Actual. She spoke into her headset, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Target the lead vessels, make every shot count. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, looked up from his console. Ma'am, their shields are absorbing our fire like we're throwing pebbles at a battleship. Then we throw more pebbles, Chen replied grimly. On the alien flagship, Commander Vextar watched the human response with growing confusion. The orbital stations should have been destroyed within minutes, but they kept fighting. Even when their Weapons proved ineffective even when their positions became untenable. The humans refused to surrender. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're intercepting human transmissions. They're coordinating a counterattack." "Impossible," Vextar hissed. "Their command structure should have collapsed by now. No species maintains organized resistance after losing their primary defensive positions." But as the battle raged, something unprecedented began to happen. Human forces that should have been broken started adapting. When their conventional weapons proved useless, they began ramming damaged ships directly into alien vessels. When their sophisticated military communications were jammed, they switched to primitive radio broadcasts. When their orbital platforms were destroyed, the survivors didn't retreat. They commandeered escape pods and turned them into guided missiles. Captain Thexano, commanding a destroyer on the invasion fleet's left flank, found himself facing a sight that defied everything he understood about warfare. A crippled human frigate, its hull torn open and atmosphere venting into space, was still firing its weapons. Even more impossibly, it was accelerating toward his ship on a collision course. "Helm, evasive maneuvers," he ordered. But his voice carried a note of bewilderment. "Why aren't they ejecting? Their ship is destroyed." His sensor operator's mandibles clicked nervously. "Sir, I'm detecting life signs aboard that vessel. At least 30 humans, including their commander." "Then why?" The human ship struck Thexano's destroyer amidships, its damaged reactor core, exploding in a brilliant flash. The alien vessel shuddered under the impact, its shields flickering as debris scattered across space. But what disturbed Thexano most wasn't the attack itself. It was the final transmission they'd intercepted. From the human ship. "This is Captain Harrison of the UES Indomitable. If you're receiving this, we've struck our target. Tell our families we held the line." Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out again and again. Human forces that should have broken instead performed acts that Zorathi military doctrine classified as impossible. They fought past the point of exhaustion, past the point of hope, past the point where surrender would have been not just logical, but merciful. Fleet Commander Zyroth observed the battle from his command center, his worst fears being realized in real time. The tactical display showed Zorathi forces winning by every measurable metric. They were destroying human ships faster than the humans could deploy them, penetrating Earth's defenses, establishing beachheads on the planet's surface. But they were also taking casualties at a rate that should have been impossible against such a technologically inferior enemy. "Fleet Commander," Vextar's voice crackled over the communications system. "We've secured orbital superiority, but the humans are adapting. They're using tactics we've never encountered before." "Explain," Zyroth said, though he suspected. He already knew the answer. "They're treating every engagement as if it's their last stand. Our psychological warfare specialists say they should have lost morale hours ago, but instead they seem to be fighting harder. And sir, they're learning. Every time we destroy one of their formations, the survivors seem to remember our tactics and counter them." On Earth's surface, the ground invasion was encountering similar impossibilities. Major Elena Vasquez crouched in the ruins of what had been downtown Los Angeles, coordinating resistance with forces that, by all rights, should have been overwhelmed within minutes. "Delta Squad, report," she spoke into her radio. "Position overrun, ma'am," came the crackling response. "Enemy armor is pushing through Sector 7. We're falling back to secondary positions." "Negative, Delta. Hold your ground." A pause. "Ma'am, we're down to 3 operational soldiers and about 2 magazines of ammunition each. Then make them count, soldier. Every minute you hold that position is another minute for civilians to evacuate." What the Zorathi couldn't understand was that humans had been preparing for this moment not for years or decades, but for millennia. Every story they'd told themselves, every myth they'd created, every legend they'd passed down through generations, they were all variations on the same theme. When everything seems lost, when the enemy is stronger, when victory is impossible, you fight anyway, because sometimes impossible things happen. Lieutenant Kraushul, leading a ground assault force through the ruins of New York City, found herself facing something her species had never encountered before. Her forces had superior numbers, superior weapons, superior armor. They should have swept through human resistance like wildfire through dry grass. Instead, she was losing soldiers to an enemy that refused to follow the rules of logical warfare. "Ma'am," her sergeant reported, "the humans have withdrawn from the financial district. Our scouts report minimal resistance ahead." Krashul's tactical mind immediately recognized the trap. "It's too easy. They're drawing us into a kill zone." "Should we advance around the area?" "Negative, we proceed as planned. But double the forward scouts and—" The explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. Then another. Then a dozen more in rapid succession. Demolition charges. Krashul realized with growing horror. They're bringing down their own buildings. The humans had turned their cities into weapons using their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to sacrifice everything, including their own infrastructure, to slow the Zorathi advance. But what truly disturbed her wasn't the tactical implications. It was the intercepted human communication that followed. "This is Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell to any human forces in the area. Manhattan Financial District has been eliminated as per Protocol 7. Enemy advance has been delayed approximately 4 hours. Recommend all forces implement similar measures in their sectors. We will not let them take our home easily." The transmission cut off, replaced by the sound of distant fighting. Krashul stared at the rubble that had once been gleaming skyscrapers. The humans had destroyed their own achievements, buildings that had taken decades to construct, without hesitation, simply to buy a few extra hours. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. For the first time in her military career, Krashul began to wonder if there was something her species had fundamentally misunderstood about warfare itself. The thought was interrupted by her communications officer. "Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission from Fleet Command. Fleet Commander. Zyroth requests immediate conference with all unit commanders." As Krashul prepared to respond, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The humans had already proven their myths weren't fantasies. What else might they prove before this war was over? Fleet Commander Zyroth stood before the assembled holographic projections of his senior officers, their scaled faces glowing with the blue light of the communication array. The invasion had been underway for 18 hours, and by every conventional metric they were winning. So why did he feel like they were walking into a trap that had been set before the first human civilization had learned to use fire? "Report casualties," he ordered. The numbers that followed would have been acceptable against any other species they'd encountered. Against the technologically primitive humans, they were catastrophic. 12 vessels destroyed, Vextar reported. Another 37 damaged to varying degrees. Ground forces have secured approximately 15% of major population centers, but resistance is intensifying rather than decreasing. Explanation? Lieutenant Krashul's image flickered as she transmitted from the ruins of what had once been Chicago. "Sir, the humans are employing tactics that defy military logic. They're sacrificing strategic positions to inflict maximum casualties on our forces. They're using their own infrastructure as weapons, and—" She paused, and Zyroth saw something in her expression he'd never seen before in a Zorathi warrior. "And what, Lieutenant?" "Sir, they're not fighting like a species trying to survive. They're fighting like a species that's already decided survival is less important than making us pay for every victory." The communication array fell silent. These were warriors who had conquered star systems, who had faced species with technology that dwarfed human achievements, but none of them had ever encountered an enemy that treated their own deaths as acceptable losses in service of a larger goal. Zyroth walked to the tactical display, studying the real-time reports flooding in from across Earth's surface. New York had become an urban warfare nightmare, with humans using their knowledge of subway tunnels and skyscrapers to stage ambushes before disappearing back into the city's maze-like structure. London's defenders had somehow turned the Thames into a weapon, using controlled flooding to channel Zorathi forces into prepared kill zones. Tokyo's population had evacuated into mountain caves, but not before rigging every major building in the city with explosives that could be triggered remotely. "They're not just fighting a military campaign," Zyroth said quietly. "They're fighting a war of attrition designed to make conquest Pyrrhic." Captain Thexano's image leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, their strategy is suicidal. They're taking casualties at a rate that would destroy any other species' will to fight. Yes, Xyroth said. That's what makes them dangerous. He manipulated the display, showing intercepted human communications from around the globe. Military. Reports, civilian broadcasts, emergency services coordination, all carrying the same underlying message. Listen to their transmissions, he commanded. The voices that filled the command center were tired, frightened, sometimes barely holding back tears. But not one of them mentioned surrender. This is Colonel Martinez, 3rd Infantry. We've lost contact with command, but mission parameters remain unchanged. Hold at all costs. Emergency services to all units in the London metropolitan area. Continue evacuation procedures. Police and military forces are maintaining defensive positions. This is Captain Singh aboard the carrier Mumbai. We're taking heavy fire and have lost main propulsion. Launching all remaining aircraft. If you're receiving this, tell command we held to the last. BBC World Service to anyone still listening. Day 2 of the invasion. Government reports that resistance continues across the globe. To all citizens in occupied areas, remember that survival is victory. Every day you remain free is another day for our forces to organize. Xyroth stopped the playback and turned to face his officers. In all our campaigns, what do defeated populations talk about? Survival terms, Vextar said immediately. Surrender conditions, preservation of their leadership structure, and what are humans talking about? The silence stretched until Thexano spoke. How to make the war more expensive for us. Exactly. Xyroth began pacing, his ancient mind working through implications that his younger officers couldn't yet grasp. Every other species we've encountered fights to minimize their losses. Humans are fighting to maximize ours. Lieutenant Krashul's voice cut through the discussion. Sir, are you suggesting we abort the invasion? The question hung in the air, like a weapon waiting to discharge. In Zarathi military history, no invasion had ever been aborted due to enemy resistance. Their technological superiority had always made victory inevitable, regardless of local tactical difficulties. But as Xyroth studied the tactical displays, he realized they were facing something unprecedented. The humans weren't just losing slowly, they were losing in a way that might make victory meaningless. Bring up the casualty projections, he ordered. The display showed mathematical models based on current engagement patterns. If human resistance continued at its present intensity, the Zarathi would indeed conquer Earth. But the cost would be approximately 60% of the invasion fleet and an estimated 2 years of continuous urban warfare. More importantly, the projections assumed that human resistance would follow normal patterns and eventually break. But what if it didn't? Sir, Vextar said carefully, these projections assume the humans maintain their current level of resistance indefinitely. No species has ever faced extinction with this level of... Xyroth searched for the word. Defiance. He switched the display to show intelligence gathered from human cultural databases. Art, literature, music, films, all of it returning to the same themes again and again. The Last Stand at the Alamo. The Charge of the Light Brigade, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Thermopylae, the Siege of Leningrad, Stalingrad, the Battle of Britain. Their entire culture is built around the concept of noble defeat, Xyroth said. They don't just tell stories about heroes who refuse to surrender, they worship them. Their greatest legends aren't about easy victories. They're about people who kept fighting when fighting was hopeless. The implications were staggering. Every other species the Zarathi had encountered possessed survival instincts that eventually overrode honor or duty. When defeat became certain, they chose preservation over principle. Humans appeared to have evolved beyond that limitation. Fleet Commander, Thexano said quietly, what are your orders? Xyroth looked at the tactical display one more time. Earth hung before them, scarred by the ongoing battle but still defiant. Still fighting, still refusing to accept the inevitable. And for the first time in his long military career, he realized that inevitable might not mean what he'd always thought it meant. All forces, he said slowly, maintain current positions but cease offensive operations. I am requesting immediate conference with High Command. Sir? Bextar's confusion was evident. Commander, in your assessment, how long would it take to completely pacify human resistance using conventional occupation methods? The younger warrior calculated quickly. Based on current patterns, possibly decades, sir, maybe longer. And the cost to our forces? A longer pause. Potentially unacceptable. Zeroth nodded grimly. Inform High Command that we may have encountered something unprecedented, a species that cannot be conquered through conventional means. Because they're too strong? Krashul asked. No, Zeroth said, his voice heavy with a realization that would change Zorathi military doctrine forever. Because they refuse to stay conquered. As his officers processed this information, Zeroth returned to his study of human mythology. All those ancient stories about heroes facing impossible odds suddenly took on a different meaning. They weren't fantasies about what humans wished they could do. They were training manuals for what humans had always been willing to do. And now the Zorathi fleet hung in orbit around a world that had just proven that some myths were more real than reality itself. The question was, what would they do about it? Epilogue. The truth that changed everything. 3 months after the invasion began, Fleet Commander Zeroth stood in the High Command chamber on the Zorathi homeworld, facing a tribunal of the most senior military leaders in their star-spanning empire. The great hall was carved from living rock, its walls decorated with the banners of conquered worlds, 17 different civilizations that had knelt before Zorathi might. Earth's banner was notably absent. Fleet Commander, Supreme War Leader Morthak spoke from the central throne, her ancient voice carrying the authority of 1,000 successful campaigns. Your report states that the human homeworld remains contested. Explain. Zeroth activated a holographic display showing Earth as it existed today. The planet's surface was scarred with the evidence of warfare. Destroyed cities, cratered landscapes, orbital debris fields. But human settlements still dotted the continents, and human ships still patrolled the outer system. Supreme War Leader, after 93 days of continuous combat, we control approximately 37% of Earth's major population centers. However, control may not be the appropriate term. Clarify. Human resistance in occupied territories continues at previous levels. Our forces cannot establish secure rear areas because human civilians have not accepted defeat. Every street corner requires constant vigilance. Every building might contain hostile forces. Our casualty rates remain at combat levels despite holding what should be secured territory. A ripple of confusion passed through the assembled commanders. War Leader Kethvor leaned forward. Are you reporting that human military forces continue to operate in occupied zones? Not just military forces, sir. Human civilians, including children and elderly individuals, continue to conduct resistance operations. They appear to make no distinction between military personnel and their general population when it comes to fighting invaders. Supreme War Leader Morthak studied the display intently. Casualties: 47 vessels destroyed, 238 damaged. Ground forces have sustained 63% casualties. At current attrition rates, we will lose effective combat capability within 6 months. The number sent shockwaves through the chamber. In 17 previous conquest campaigns, total Zorathi casualties had never exceeded 8%. Recommendations? Morthak asked. Zeroth had been dreading this moment for weeks. Supreme War Leader, I recommend immediate withdrawal from the Sol system and classification of humanity as a species unsuitable for conquest. The silence that followed was deafening. War Leader Kethvor's mandibles clicked in disbelief. Fleet Commander, are you suggesting that a technologically primitive species has defeated the Zorathi Empire? No, sir. I'm suggesting that they cannot be defeated through conventional means. Zeroth manipulated the display, showing footage that had been transmitted by reconnaissance drones. Human children learning to use military weapons. Elderly humans coordinating supply lines for resistance fighters. Human artists creating propaganda that somehow increased rather than decreased their species' will to fight. Every other species we have encountered possesses a rational hierarchy of needs, he continued. Survival supersedes honor. Preservation supersedes principle. When defeat becomes inevitable, they choose existence over resistance. And humans appear to have evolved a cultural mechanism that reverses this hierarchy. They genuinely consider some ideals more important than survival. The implications were staggering. The Zorathi Empire had built its expansion on the assumption that all intelligent life operated according to predictable patterns. Superior force led to surrender, which led to successful occupation. But what if an entire species simply refused to surrender? War leader Thondar spoke from the far end of the chamber. Fleet Commander, your report mentioned something called human mythology. Explain its relevance. Sir, we initially dismissed human mythological stories as primitive superstitions. However, further analysis suggests they serve a different function. They are not fantasies about impossible heroes. They are cultural programming designed to prepare humans for situations exactly like our invasion. Zyroth changed the display to show human artwork, ancient cave paintings depicting hunters facing massive predators, medieval tapestries showing knights confronting dragons, modern films about ordinary individuals defying overwhelming odds. Every human culture across all continents and historical periods creates stories with the same theme: individuals of their species refusing to surrender in hopeless situations and somehow achieving victory through determination alone. Mythology, War Leader Kethavor said dismissively. Yes, sir. Mythology that they have now proven to be literally true. The display showed recent battlefield footage. A human soldier with a broken arm continuing to fight after his position was overrun. A civilian engineer who had spent 6 days manually repairing a damaged communications array while under constant fire. A group of human children who had somehow sabotaged an entire Zorathi supply depot using nothing but improvised explosives and their knowledge of their city's sewer system. Supreme War Leader, Zyroth said, we have encountered something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that has culturally evolved beyond the survival instinct that limits all other intelligent life. You're suggesting they're not intelligent? I'm suggesting they're more intelligent than we are. Another shocked silence. Finally, Supreme War Leader Morthak spoke. Elaborate. Every species seeks individual survival above all else. This limits their strategic options and makes them predictable. Humans have somehow trained themselves to value collective survival above individual survival. This makes them capable of strategies that are literally unthinkable to us. Zyroth showed them the final piece of evidence: intercepted human transmissions from the past week. These are communications between Earth and their outer colonies, Mars, Europa, the asteroid belt. Their generation ships heading to other star systems. Do you know what they're discussing? Surrender terms? War Leader Thondar suggested. Revenge. The word hung in the air like a weapon. The humans have accepted that Earth might fall, but instead of seeking terms, they're coordinating a counterattack. They're planning to pursue our forces back to Zorathi space and continue the war on our territory. War Leader Kethavor's scales rippled with shock. That's impossible. They lack the technology for interstellar warfare. They lack the technology to seriously damage our invasion fleet, Zyroth replied. Yet 47 of our vessels are now space debris. He brought up the final intelligence report, the one that had convinced him that withdrawal was not just advisable but necessary for the survival of the Zorathi Empire. Human engineers have been studying our technology throughout the invasion. Not just our weapons, but our ships, our power systems, our manufacturing techniques. They're reverse engineering everything they can capture. Standard procedure for a defeated species, Morthak observed. Supreme War Leader, they're not trying to build defenses, they're building a fleet. The display showed intelligence gathered from human manufacturing centers that had been hidden throughout their solar system. Asteroid mines that had been converted to shipyards. Industrial facilities on Mars working around the clock to produce weapons. Generation ships that were being retrofitted with reverse-engineered Zorathi technology. In approximately 18 months, human forces will possess interstellar capability. They will come looking for us. Let them come, War Leader Kethavor said. We'll destroy them in space where their guerrilla tactics won't help them. Xyroth shook his head. Sir, with respect, you're still thinking like a rational species. Humans don't fight to win battles. They fight to make wars so expensive that their enemies abandon them as unprofitable. He showed them the projections his staff had prepared. If humans gained interstellar capability and launched a campaign against Zorathi territories, they wouldn't need to win. They would simply need to make conquest and occupation of human space more costly than avoiding it. They're not trying to defeat us militarily, Xyroth continued. They're trying to make us conclude that leaving them alone is preferable to continued conflict. And they were succeeding. Supreme War Leader Morthak studied the data for a long time. Finally, she looked up at Xyroth. Fleet Commander, in your professional opinion, can humanity be integrated into the Empire through conventional conquest? No, sir. Can they be defeated through overwhelming force? Not without losses that would cripple the Empire for generations. And if we withdraw, they will likely establish themselves as a regional power and expand their territory through colonization rather than conquest. Unless we attack them again, they will probably ignore us. Morthak's decision would reshape galactic politics for millennia to come. All forces are to withdraw from the Sol system immediately. Humanity is to be classified as a protected species under Imperial Decree 847, territorial integrity, guaranteed in exchange for non-interference in imperial affairs. The assembled war leaders absorbed this information in stunned silence, for, the first time in their history, the Zorathi Empire was abandoning a conquest not because it was impossible, but because it was too expensive.